Stay in the kitchen. Your sister will handle the investors. My father hissed the words while yanking the apron right off my neck. He snatched my signature wagyu tartare out of my hands and passed it to my younger sister, a woman wearing a $3,000 designer dress paid for by my kitchen budget. She was about to walk into the dining room and present my recipe to a $10 million investor as her own brilliant creation. I did not yell. I did not cry. I simply untied the strings of my chef coat, dropped my apron onto the greasy tile floor, and whispered, "Have fun cooking the halibut, Dad." Then I walked out the back door. 5 minutes later, that lead investor stood up in the middle of the crowded dining room, announced that the Michelin star chef he came to fund had just quit, tore his $10 million check into pieces, and walked out too. My name is Gemma. I am 33 years old, and I spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table where my family only ever viewed me as the hired help. Before I dive into the rest of this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to walk away from a toxic family to build your own empire. Your support means everything to me, and trust me, the payoff in this story is something you will not want to miss. Growing up in our household, there was a clear hierarchy. My younger sister Sloane was the golden child destined for greatness without ever having to lift a finger to achieve it. Meanwhile, I was the workhorse. I spent the last decade grinding my way through the culinary world, enduring grueling hours, burns, and cuts, eventually earning a Michelin star at a top restaurant in New York. But when my parents decided to open an upscale dining establishment in downtown Chicago called The Legacy, they played the ultimate family guilt trip. They begged me to come home. They promised me total creative control, a genuine partnership, and a chance to build something beautiful together. I foolishly believed them. The reality hit me hard on opening night. The kitchen was an absolute war zone. The air was thick with the smell of seared meat, melted butter, and pure adrenaline. The ticket printer was screaming non-stop. I was standing at the stainless steel prep station, sweat pouring down my forehead, trying to keep the line moving. We were in the weeds, but the food coming out of my kitchen was flawless. I was meticulously plating the wagyu beef tartare, adding the final drops of truffle oil and delicate microgreens, when the kitchen doors violently swung open. My father Richard stormed in. His face was red, and he looked at me not like a proud father or a business partner, but like a disobedient servant. He did not ask how the service was going. He did not thank me for working a 14-hour shift. He marched right up to my station, grabbed the heavy canvas apron around my neck, and physically yanked it to stop me from moving. "Stay in the kitchen," he commanded, his voice dripping with condescension. "Your sister will handle the investors." Before I could even process the sheer disrespect of his words, Sloane strutted through the double doors. She was not wearing a chef coat or sensible shoes. She was wearing a stunning $3,000 emerald green silk dress and strappy designer heels. I knew exactly how much that dress cost because I had seen the invoice flagged on the restaurant expense account under marketing materials. She had drained the budget I desperately needed for high-quality ingredients just so she could play pretend restaurant owner. Sloane gave me a sickeningly sweet smile, the kind she always used when she was stealing the credit for my hard work. She reached out and took the plate of wagyu tartare right from my hands. She adjusted her hair, checked her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door, and prepared to walk out to the VIP room to introduce my culinary masterpiece as her own creative vision. My father stood there beaming at her with a pride he had never once shown me. In that sweltering kitchen, surrounded by the chaos of clinking pans and shouting line cooks, a profound clarity washed over me. I realized that no matter how hard I worked, no matter how many stars I earned or menus I perfected, I would never be anything more than the invisible engine powering their vanity project. They did not want a partner. They wanted a ghostwriter for their success. I looked at my father. I refused to give him the satisfaction of an argument. I reached down, calmly untied the knot of my apron, and let the heavy fabric slide off my shoulders. It hit the greasy floor with a soft thud. I looked him dead in the eye, my voice steady and cold. "Have fun cooking the halibut, Dad?" I turned my back on him and walked out the rear exit, leaving him standing there as the ticket machine continued to spit out a dozen new orders that nobody else in that building knew how to cook. The cool night air of Chicago hit my face the second I pushed through the heavy metal alley doors. The contrast between the suffocating heat of the kitchen and the crisp evening breeze felt like waking up from a long, bad dream. I walked briskly around the side of the building toward the valet stand, fishing my keys out of my pocket. I just wanted to get to my car and disappear. But my escape was interrupted. Standing right by the valet podium, adjusting his expensive tie, was Kendrick. Kendrick is Sloane's husband, an African-American finance bro who loved to wear custom-tailored suits and throw around corporate buzzwords. My family had appointed him as the chief financial officer of the restaurant, despite the fact that he had absolutely no idea how restaurant margins or food costs actually worked. He was smooth-talking, arrogant, and opportunistic. As soon as he saw me walking away from the building in my stained chef coat, his smug smile faltered, replaced by a deep scowl. He stepped right into my path, physically blocking me from reaching the valet attendant. "Where do you think you are going?" he demanded, crossing his arms over his chest. I looked at him, completely exhausted by the endless entitlement of this family. "I am going home, Kendrick. I am done." Kendrick let out a harsh, mocking laugh. He leaned in closer, trying to use his height to intimidate me. "Do not throw a tantrum just because Sloane is the face of the brand, Gemma. You need to get back in there and do your job. You are just the hired help here. You should be used to playing the background by now. It is just like when you paid off her student loans and we let you live in the basement. You do the heavy lifting and we handle the business. Now get back to the grill before you ruin this for all of us." His words were meant to hurt me, to put me back in my designated place as the family scapegoat. He casually brought up the $50,000 I had drained from my own savings years ago to bail Sloane out of her college debt, framing it as if they had done me a favor by letting me sleep in a damp basement while I worked 3 jobs to recover. He thought invoking the past would make me fold. He thought I was still that desperate approval-seeking girl. He was wrong. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply stepped around him, handed my ticket to the wide-eyed valet attendant, and waited in silence. Kendrick kept talking, threatening me with breach of contract, warning me about how disappointed my mother would be, throwing every manipulative tactic he had at the wall. I tuned him out completely. When my car pulled up, I tipped the valet a $20 bill, opened my door, and slid into the driver's seat. Kendrick grabbed the edge of my car door before I could close it. "I am warning you, Gemma. If you drive away, you are throwing away everything." I looked up at him, offering a small, razor-sharp smile. "I am not throwing it away, Kendrick. I am taking it with me." I pulled the door shut, locking it instantly. As he stood there glaring at me through the glass, I pulled out my phone. I opened my contacts and found the number for Harrison, the ruthless Silicon Valley venture capitalist who was sitting in the VIP room right now. Harrison was the lead investor, the man holding a $10 million term sheet that my family desperately needed to keep this restaurant afloat. He was a man who knew food, knew business, and did not tolerate incompetence. I typed out a single, precise text message. "I quit. The menu is mine, but the clowns are running the circus." I pressed send, put the car in drive, and pulled out into the Chicago traffic, leaving Kendrick fuming on the curb. As I drove away, I knew exactly what was about to happen inside that dining room, and for the first time in my life, I felt completely free. I sat in my car, idling by the curb across the street from the Legacy, watching everything unfold through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the restaurant, which offered a perfect, illuminated view of the VIP dining room. Inside the building, my family was putting on the performance of a lifetime, and from my dark vantage point, I had a front-row seat to the exact moment my text message was delivered. Inside the private glass-walled section of the restaurant, the atmosphere looked exactly like a scene from a high-society magazine. My mother, Patricia, was holding court with local socialites, smiling brightly. Kendrick was laughing loudly with a group of investors, pretending he understood high finance. And sitting at the head of the long, polished mahogany table was Harrison. Even from a distance, Harrison commanded the entire room. He was a ruthless man who built his empire by recognizing raw talent and aggressively cutting away dead weight. He did not care about family legacies or social climbing. He only cared about maximum profit and absolute perfection. I watched closely as his phone screen suddenly illuminated flat on the table. He slowly picked it up, and I knew he was reading the single sentence I had just sent him, stating, "I quit, the menu is mine, but the clowns are running the circus." I saw Harrison slowly lower the cellular device. His expression did not quickly change to visible shock or immediate anger. Instead, a cold, calculating realization visibly settled over his sharp features. He looked up from the glowing screen and silently observed the crowded room. He looked at my father, Richard, who was nervously hovering near the swinging kitchen doors wearing a tailored suit. He looked at Kendrick, who was aggressively adjusting his expensive silver watch and boasting about profit margins he did not actually comprehend. And then he looked at Sloane. My younger sister had just glided smoothly into the VIP room. She was delicately holding the ceramic plate of my signature wagyu tartare as if it were a fragile royal crown. She smiled her signature radiant smile, a heavily practiced expression carefully designed to charm investment money out of deep pockets. She walked directly toward Harrison, confidently placing the beautiful dish directly in front of him with a dramatic, sweeping flourish. Even through the thick glass, I could practically hear her reciting the rehearsed script my parents had written specifically for her, shamelessly claiming my countless hours of preparation and immense culinary expertise as her own personal creative genius. Harrison did not even glance down at the exquisite food. He just stared coldly at Sloane. He saw the spotless emerald designer dress, the perfect professional manicure, and the complete absolute absence of a single kitchen burn or knife callus anywhere on her soft, unworked hands. The missing puzzle pieces finally clicked together in his brilliant mind. He instantly knew exactly who was the exhausted workhorse and who was the useless show pony in this completely dysfunctional family dynamic. Harrison reached forward and picked up a heavy crystal water glass and a solid silver butter knife from the pristine table setting. He deliberately tapped the silver knife against the crystal rim. The sharp, clear ringing sound cut violently through the ambient noise and soft jazz music playing in the upscale restaurant. I watched intently as the cheerful chatter in the packed VIP room instantly died down to a nervous hush. All eyes immediately turned to the billionaire sitting at the head of the mahogany table. Richard proudly puffed out his chest, clearly expecting a generous toast to their grand opening success. Patricia smiled proudly, her eyes gleaming with the anticipation of wealth. Sloane stood tall and confident, eagerly waiting for her unearned praise and validation. Harrison stood up slowly and deliberately, buttoning the center button of his custom-tailored dark navy suit jacket. He took a moment to look around the silent room, making intense eye contact with every single elite guest and potential investor, before finally focusing his piercing, intimidating gaze entirely on my family. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this highly anticipated opening. Harrison began, his deep voice projecting clearly enough that the bustling waitstaff completely froze in their tracks. I came here this evening fully prepared to invest $10 million into this fine establishment. I came here solely because I firmly believe in backing rare generational culinary talent. A collective murmur of excitement and approval rippled through the wealthy guests. My parents beamed with arrogant pride. But Harrison quickly held up a strong hand to instantly silence them. He calmly pulled his mobile phone from his suit pocket and held it up for the room to see. However, I just received a very illuminating text message. It seems the Michelin star chef I actually came here to fund has just resigned because of the profound incompetence running this operation. The color completely drained from my father, Richard, leaving his face a pale, sickly shade of white. Patricia gasped loudly, her manicured hand flying up to clutch her expensive pearl necklace in pure shock. Kendrick stopped laughing entirely, his fake, confident smile dropping into a mask of pure panic. Sloane frantically panicking as the golden spotlight violently shifted away from her, desperately tried to save the collapsing moment. She leaned in closer to the table, her voice shrill and dripping with desperate manipulation as she foolishly tried to interrupt the billionaire. But Harrison, She stammered awkwardly, holding her soft hands out in a pleading gesture. I am right here standing before you. The menu is my beautiful vision. We have absolutely everything under perfect control. Gemma is just having a little emotional meltdown in the back, but the restaurant is perfectly fine and ready for your money. Harrison looked down at her with a look of absolute unadulterated disgust. You do not even have the basic vision to boil water, Sloane, he stated coldly, his voice echoing in the dead silent room. He slowly reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of neatly folded legal papers. It was the finalized $10 million term sheet, the ultimate golden ticket my family had been desperately banking on to save their fraudulent business from imminent financial ruin. Without breaking his icy eye contact with my trembling sister, Harrison gripped the thick parchment firmly in both of his hands. With a sharp, violent, and incredibly deliberate motion, he tore the entire contract straight down the middle. The loud sound of the tearing paper seemed to echo endlessly through the stunned silence of the dining room. Sloane let out a small, pathetic squeak of utter horror. Harrison ruthlessly tore the pages again, and then a third time, reducing the massive multi-million-dollar agreement to a handful of totally worthless white scraps. He held his hand out directly over Sloane and her glass of expensive red wine, slowly opening his fingers. The torn pieces of the ruined contract fluttered down, splashing into the deep red liquid and sinking to the bottom. I am out, Harrison stated coldly, and left the room. I sat on the worn fabric of my living room sofa, staring blankly at the muted television screen. It was 2 a.m. The adrenaline that had carried me out of the restaurant and through the drive home had completely evaporated, leaving behind a deep exhaustion in my bones. My phone had been vibrating non-stop on the coffee table for hours, illuminating the dark room with endless missed calls from my mother, father, and sister. I had ignored every single one of them. For the first time in years, the suffocating pressure of my family expectations was gone. I took a slow, deep breath, savoring the quiet peace of my small apartment. But that peace was violently shattered a few moments later. Heavy, aggressive pounding echoed against my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic, demanding pounding of people who believed they owned the space behind the door. I did not move at first, hoping they would simply give up and walk away. But the pounding grew louder, rattling the cheap wood in its frame. Open the door, Gemma. We know you are in there, my father shouted loudly, his voice muffled but unmistakable. I slowly stood up, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor, and walked over to the door. I unlatched the heavy deadbolt and pulled the door open just a few inches. Before I could even say a single word, the door was forcefully pushed open the rest of the way. Richard, Patricia, and Kendrick stormed into my living room like an invading army. They were still wearing their expensive opening night outfits, but they looked completely disheveled. My father's tailored suit jacket was unbuttoned, and his face was flushed a deep, angry red. My mother, Patricia, looked frantic, her eyes wide and her perfect hair slightly undone. Kendrick walked in last, wearing a smug, arrogant expression that immediately made my stomach turn. They did not ask if they could come in. They did not apologize for waking me up or for the terrible way they had treated me earlier that evening. Instead, they immediately surrounded me in the center of my own living room, launching into a highly coordinated, relentless verbal assault. They were determined to break me down completely and force me to fix the massive disaster they had created for themselves entirely on their very own tonight. How could you do this to us? My mother screamed, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. Do you have any idea what you just did to your sister? She is completely humiliated, Gemma. She has been crying in the restaurant office for 3 solid hours because you decided to throw a selfish little temper tantrum in front of the most important man in Chicago. I stood there looking at her, completely bewildered by her intense delusion. I threw a tantrum, I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and low. Dad literally ripped my apron off my neck and tried to serve my food under her name. I just removed myself from the situation. My father stepped forward, invading my personal space and pointing a thick finger directly in my face. "You ruined the biggest night of our lives," he bellowed. Harrison walked out, taking $10 million with him, all because you could not swallow your pride for 5 tiny minutes and let your sister have a moment in the spotlight. You are going to fix this right now. You are going to pick up your phone, call Harrison, and beg him to come back. You will tell him that you were just having an emotional breakdown and that you are fully committed to working under Sloane's creative direction now. I looked closely at my father, then at my mother, and finally at Kendrick, who was leaning casually against my wall with his arms crossed. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of their sudden demand was almost comical to me. They had driven straight to my apartment in the middle of the night not to ask for my forgiveness, but to demand my absolute submission. "I am not calling Harrison," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely resolute. "And I am definitely not working under Sloane. The restaurant is your problem now. You wanted to run the show, so go right ahead and run it. I am completely done with the legacy, and I am completely done with being your convenient scapegoat." My mother dramatically covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly about how incredibly ungrateful I was after everything they had supposedly done for me. My father opened his mouth to yell loudly again, but Kendrick quickly held up a hand, stopping him completely. Kendrick pushed himself off the wall and took a slow, deliberate step toward me. His fake corporate smile returned, spreading across his face like a venomous snake preparing to strike me down where I stood. "I figured you would be stubborn," Gemma Kendrick said, reaching inside his suit jacket. "That is why I came prepared." Kendrick pulled out a thick stack of legal papers. He tossed the documents onto my coffee table with a slap. "That is a formal cease and desist order," he announced. "Since you want to act like a child, the company is taking immediate legal action against you for abandonment of duty. We are prepared to sue you for the loss of the $10 million investment." Kendrick laughed out loud. "But that is not the best part. When you developed those recipes, you did it using our kitchen, our ingredients, and our company time. Therefore, under corporate law, every single recipe you created, every menu item, and every plating design is the exclusive property of the Legacy Limited Liability Company. You do not own your food anymore, Gemma. We do. If you ever try to cook those dishes anywhere in the United States, we will bankrupt you. So you can either call Harrison right now or prepare to lose everything." The morning sun filtered through the thin blinds of my bedroom window, casting long shadows across the floor. I woke up with a dull ache behind my eyes. I had barely slept after my family stormed out of my apartment. The heavy silence of the morning was a stark contrast to the screaming match that had taken place in my living room just hours before. I rolled over and reached for my phone on the nightstand. I expected to see a few missed calls or angry text messages, but what I found was far worse than a standard family argument. My phone screen was completely covered in a continuous stream of notifications from social media applications. I had hundreds of new messages from people I did not even know. My stomach tightened as I unlocked the screen and opened the first notification. It was a link to a video on social media. I tapped the screen and the video immediately began to play. There was my younger sister Sloane sitting on the floor of her perfectly decorated bedroom. She was wearing an oversized gray sweater pulled down over one shoulder to make her look fragile and incredibly vulnerable to viewers. Her blonde hair was deliberately messy, and her mascara was carefully smudged under her eyes to create the perfect illusion of recent crying. The lighting was soft and cinematic. It was a highly produced performance. I watched in total disbelief as she looked directly into the camera lens with wide, innocent eyes. She took a deep, shaky breath before she started speaking. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice trembling perfectly. "I did not want to make this video, but I feel like I owe you all an explanation for what happened at the grand opening of our family restaurant yesterday." She wiped a fake tear from her cheek. "As many of you know, my family and I have poured our entire hearts and our entire life savings into building the legacy. It was our ultimate dream. But last night, that dream was maliciously sabotaged by the one person we trusted the most." Sloane paused for dramatic effect, looking down at her lap before forcing herself to look back up. She continued her fabricated story with absolute conviction. My older sister Gemma has always struggled with severe jealousy and deep-seated emotional issues. We tried our very best to help her. We gave her a job in our kitchen, hoping it would give her a sense of purpose. But last night, when we had the most important investor in the building, she completely snapped. She threw an unhinged temper tantrum right in the middle of a dinner service just because she was not the center of attention. She screamed at our father, threw her apron on the floor, and walked out, leaving us completely stranded. Because of her spiteful actions, our lead investor pulled his $10 million funding. She destroyed our family business out of pure jealousy and spite today. I sat up in my bed, staring at the screen as the video looped back to the beginning. The view count at the bottom of the screen was climbing rapidly. It had already surpassed 200,000 views, and the numbers were spinning higher every single second. The comment section was a complete nightmare. Thousands of strangers were tearing me apart, based entirely on Sloane's ridiculous lies. People were calling me a narcissistic monster, a terrible sister, and a complete failure. They were praising Sloane for her bravery and offering their deepest sympathies to my poor, heartbroken, innocent family members. Some people were even trying to figure out where I lived, so they could leave terrible reviews on my personal professional profiles. Sloane had weaponized her social media following and pointed a massive digital mob directly at my life. She knew exactly what she was doing. She was controlling the narrative before I even had a chance to defend myself. My phone vibrated in my hand, abruptly pulling me out of the comments section. A new text message appeared at the top of the screen. It was from my mother, Patricia. I opened the message and stared in total shock. I stared at the cold, cruel words she had typed. The message read, "You have completely destroyed your sister. Look at the pain you caused her. You are dead to us until you fix this and publicly apologize for your disgusting behavior." There was no question mark. There was no room for discussion. My mother had clearly watched the same fake crying video I had just watched, and she was completely supporting the lie. She was willing to let her youngest daughter publicly assassinate my character just to save face and protect their completely failed new business venture project together. They wanted me to grovel. They wanted me to break down under the immense public pressure and come crawling back to them begging for forgiveness. Normally, this is the exact moment where the old version of me would have completely broken down. The old Gemma would have started crying uncontrollably. She would have internalized all of the guilt and panic. She would have desperately tried to draft a long emotional response explaining her side of the story and begging for her family to simply listen to the truth. She would have called them and apologized profusely to keep total peace. She would have done anything just to make the horrible conflict go away. But as I sat there in my quiet apartment reading that hateful message from the woman who gave birth to me, I realized something profound. I did not feel sad. I did not feel guilty. I did not even feel the urge to cry. The well of tears I had spent a lifetime crying over these people was completely dry. All I felt was a cold, calculating clarity. They had officially crossed the line of no return. This was no longer just a toxic family dynamic today. This was a direct attack on my professional reputation and my livelihood. Kendrick had threatened to steal my recipes and bankrupt me. Sloane was actively trying to destroy my public image. And my parents were fully endorsing the entire campaign of destruction. They genuinely thought I was weak. They thought I would just sit back and let them walk all over me, because I had always done exactly that in the past. They did not realize that by pushing me completely out of the family, they had accidentally untied my hands. I no longer had any obligations to protect them. I did not reply to my mother's text message. Instead, I immediately took a screenshot of the text, saving it securely. Then I went back to the application and downloaded Sloane's tearful video, ensuring I had permanent proof of her defamation. I captured screenshots of the damaging comments documenting the massive harassment campaign. With all the evidence safely secured, I felt perfectly calm. I opened my contacts and dialed my intellectual property attorney. They wanted a dirty war to steal everything I had built. They thought they held all the winning cards, but I owned the entire playing deck now. I drove downtown to the gleaming glass building where my intellectual property attorney had his office. The city of Chicago was bustling with morning traffic, but inside my car everything felt incredibly still. Just 12 hours ago, my family stood in my living room and threatened to destroy my entire life. They handed me a cease and desist letter that was supposed to terrify me into total submission. They truly believed that paper was a loaded weapon pointed directly at my career. They thought I would be paralyzed by the fear of losing everything I had worked so hard to build. But as I rode the elevator up to the 40th floor, holding my leather portfolio tightly against my chest, I did not feel fear. I felt a deep sense of absolute vindication. Walking into the polished reception area, I was greeted by my lawyer, David. David was a brilliant legal mind who specialized in corporate law and culinary intellectual property. I handed him the threatening letter Kendrick had slammed onto my coffee table the night before. David adjusted his glasses, read through the document carefully, and then did something I will never forget. He actually laughed out loud. David tossed the heavy legal document onto his pristine wooden desk like it was a piece of useless trash. He looked at me with a wide smile and shook his head in pure disbelief. "Your brother-in-law is a complete amateur," David said, leaning back in his leather chair. "He writes like someone who watched a few courtroom television shows and learned a bunch of fancy legal words. He claims that the restaurant owns your recipes because you developed them on company time. But here is the massive fatal flaw in his entire arrogant strategy. Kendrick never made you sign a non-disclosure agreement. He never drafted a single intellectual property assignment contract. There is absolutely zero paperwork tying the legal ownership of your creative work to the Legacy Limited Liability Company." I sat there letting the weight of his words wash over me. Kendrick was supposed to be this high-powered financial genius. He was the man my parents trusted blindly with their entire life savings. He walked around the restaurant in his custom suits acting like he was a corporate titan. But in reality, he was just a lazy, incompetent fraud who skipped the most fundamental legal steps of opening a business. He was so busy trying to look important that he completely forgot to actually protect the company assets. The truth is, I had figured out his incompetence a long time ago. About 6 months before the restaurant even opened, I started noticing strange discrepancies in my kitchen budget. I am a chef who meticulously tracks every single ounce of saffron and every cut of premium wagyu beef. I know exactly how much my ingredients cost down to the penny. So when my weekly budget reports started coming up short by thousands of dollars, I knew something was terribly wrong. I stayed late one night and quietly dug through the digital accounting files. That is when I found the terrible truth. Kendrick was actively skimming money from the kitchen operating budget. He was quietly funneling cash into a separate account to pay off his own personal luxury car lease and to fund Sloane's ridiculous designer shopping sprees. When I realized my own brother-in-law was stealing from the very kitchen I was trying to build, a cold, hard reality hit me. I knew right then and there that my family would eventually betray me. I knew they would drain me dry and throw me away the second I stopped being useful to them. So I decided to quietly protect myself before they ever had the chance to ruin me. I did not confront Kendrick about the stolen money. I did not run crying to my parents because I knew they would just blindly defend him and blame me for snooping. Instead, I took all of my personal savings and hired David. For the last 6 months, while my family was busy picking out expensive curtains and tasting expensive wines, David and I were secretly doing the real work. We filed federal trademarks for the names of every single signature dish I created for the restaurant menu. But we did not stop there. We also filed legal copyright protections for the exact visual plating designs of my food. In the culinary world, proving ownership of a recipe can be difficult, but owning the federal trademark to the name and the exact visual presentation is an absolute ironclad legal shield. My family thought they had trapped me. They thought they owned my talent, my recipes, and my future. They believed I was just a naive chef who would blindly hand over my life work for a tiny shred of family approval. They were completely wrong about absolutely everything today. As I sat in David's office looking out over the beautiful Chicago skyline, I realized the ultimate irony of the situation. Kendrick had threatened to bankrupt me if I ever dared to cook my own food again. But because of his own stunning incompetence and my diligent secret preparation, I actually owned absolutely everything. I owned the wagyu tartare. I owned the signature desserts. I owned the complete legal identity of the entire business they were trying to steal from me. The Legacy had a fully booked dining room opening tonight, and they were legally barred from serving a single item on that menu. If they tried to plate my food, they would be committing massive federal trademark infringement. I smiled at David as he happily prepared the official legal paperwork. We were not just going to send them a friendly warning. We were going to drop a massive financial bomb directly on their grand opening dinner service. I stood up from my comfortable leather chair, feeling incredibly powerful today. It was finally time to strike back right now. The sun set over the Chicago skyline, painting the city in shades of orange. It was exactly 6 o'clock on a Friday evening. This was supposed to be the most important night of my entire career. It was the first official public dinner service for the Legacy. But instead of standing in a sweltering kitchen shouting orders to a dedicated line of cooks, I was sitting comfortably on my living room sofa wearing soft cotton pajamas. I had a warm cup of tea in my hands and a digital tablet resting on my lap. I was not there to cook, but I was absolutely present to watch the show. My family had foolishly decided to proceed with the grand opening without me. They honestly believed that anyone could simply walk into a commercial kitchen, read a piece of paper, and replicate a decade of intensive culinary training. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson in arrogance. I had a secret informant inside the restaurant. Matteo was a young, ambitious dishwasher I had hired a few months ago. He was incredibly loyal to me because I was the only person in the building who treated him with basic human respect. While my father Richard barked orders and Kendrick looked down his nose at the support staff, I made sure Matteo got a free hot meal every single shift. Now Matteo was standing near the dish pit, secretly sending me detailed text messages about every single disaster unfolding in real time. The messages started arriving almost immediately after the front doors opened to the public. The replacement head chef Kendrick had hastily hired from a mediocre corporate chain restaurant was already completely overwhelmed by the intense pressure. According to Matteo, the kitchen was in a state of absolute chaos. The ticket printer was a continuous waterfall of white paper spilling onto the greasy floor. The new chef did not understand the complex timing required for fine dining. Matteo sent me a photo of a premium bone and ribeye steak that was supposed to be served medium rare. It was burnt to an unrecognizable charred crisp. 5 minutes later, another text message arrived. A prominent local business owner had just sent back a plate of seared scallops because they were completely raw and freezing cold in the center. The dining room, which my mother Patricia had meticulously decorated to look like an elegant sanctuary of high society, was quickly turning into a hostile environment. Guests were waiting over an hour just to receive their appetizers. Waiters were hiding in the server alleys, terrified to approach their tables empty-handed. I opened the Yelp application on my tablet and refreshed the restaurant page. The Legacy had started the morning with a handful of glowing 5-star reviews, mostly left by my parents' wealthy friends, who had attended the private VIP tasting the week before. But now the real reviews were flooding in, and they were absolutely brutal. I watched in real time as the overall rating plummeted. One reviewer wrote that the roasted chicken was so undercooked it practically clucked when they cut into it. Another angry guest posted a picture of Sloane standing in the middle of the dining room, nervously scrolling through her phone instead of helping the furious customers. The reviewer explicitly mentioned that the so-called creative director looked like a deer caught in the headlights. The rating dropped to 3 stars, then 2 stars, and finally settled at a dismal 1.5 stars. I took a sip of tea, feeling a profound sense of peaceful satisfaction. Back at the restaurant, the situation was rapidly deteriorating into a complete financial catastrophe. Kendrick was pacing the length of the main dining room, sweating heavily right through the fabric of his expensive custom-tailored suit. He had spent the last 2 days arrogantly telling anyone who would listen that my departure was a minor bump in the road and that the brand was much bigger than any single chef. Now he was desperately trying to smooth things over with a dining room full of wealthy Chicago patrons who were aggressively demanding immediate refunds. My father Richard was red in the face, marching back and forth between the kitchen and the host stand, shouting useless instructions at the terrified staff. My mother completely disappeared into the back office, allegedly suffering from a severe migraine, but I knew she was simply hiding from the public humiliation. Then Matteo sent me the most critical update of the entire evening. A table of 4 very important guests had just been seated in the center of the dining room. They were not just wealthy locals looking for a nice meal. They were prominent food critics representing the most widely read culinary publications in the city. Kendrick had personally invited them weeks ago, expecting them to write glowing feature articles about his brilliant new financial venture. Now they were sitting at a premium table watching the total collapse of the restaurant unfold right in front of their eyes. They had already rejected their main courses after discovering the fish was spoiled and the vegetables were completely unseasoned. The lead critic, a notoriously harsh writer who could single-handedly make or break a new restaurant with one article, had already signaled for the check. Kendrick was in a state of absolute blinding panic. He knew that if those critics walked out the door and published their honest reviews, the legacy would be completely bankrupt before the end of the month. He needed a miracle to save his fractured ego and his massive financial investment. According to Matteo, Kendrick sprinted past my father and violently pushed his way through the swinging doors into the hot kitchen. He ignored the burning pans and the shouting line cooks. He marched directly up to the sweating replacement chef and pointed a shaking finger at the dessert station. He loudly ordered the kitchen staff to immediately begin assembling my signature dessert. It was a beautiful creation involving spun sugar, dark chocolate ganache, and a delicate raspberry coulis. It was a visual masterpiece that had won me awards in New York, and Kendrick knew it was the only thing that could possibly appease the angry critics. He was so desperate to save face that he completely forgot the legal threat he slapped onto my coffee table 24 hours earlier. He completely forgot all of the incredibly loud and wildly arrogant demands he made in my living room. He truly only cared about desperately saving his own fragile reputation right in this exact moment. He stood over the panicked cooks, barking frantic orders as they desperately tried to replicate my complex plating design from a printed photograph pinned to the wall. Matteo texted me a picture of Kendrick personally wiping the edges of the ceramic plates with a white towel, preparing to carry them out to the dining room himself. I smiled widely at my screen and set my teacup down on the wooden table. Kendrick thought he was staging a brilliant last-minute rescue. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking right into my waiting legal trap. The tension in my small living room was palpable. Matteo was keeping me updated with a rapid-fire string of text messages. The situation inside the legacy had escalated from a minor disaster to a full-blown culinary emergency. Kendrick was operating under the delusion that he could simply throw sugar at the problem and make it go away. He had commandeered the kitchen, forcing the terrified replacement line cooks to plate my award-winning signature dessert. It was a complex architectural masterpiece consisting of a delicate dark chocolate ganache sphere resting on a bed of toasted hazelnut soil, crowned with a fragile halo of spun sugar, and finished with a tart raspberry coulis that had to be poured exactly at the moment of service. It was a dessert that required extreme precision and a deep understanding of flavor profiles. Kendrick had absolutely none of those things, but he was incredibly desperate. He personally loaded the 4 finished plates onto a large silver serving tray. He wiped his sweating forehead plastered on his fake corporate smile and pushed his way through the swinging kitchen doors. He was heading straight for the center table, where the 4 most influential food critics in Chicago were sitting with their arms crossed, looking thoroughly unimpressed and completely ready to destroy my family in the morning papers. Matteo sent me a shaky video taken from his vantage point near the dish pit. I watched on my tablet screen as Kendrick practically sprinted across the dining room floor. He was dodging angry customers who were waving their hands demanding the check. The dining room was a loud cacophony of complaining voices and clinking silverware on untouched plates. My father, Richard, was standing near the front host stand, looking completely defeated, while wealthy, angry patrons yelled at him about raw chicken and ruined anniversary dinners. Sloane was nowhere to be found, likely hiding in the back office, scrolling through her ruined social media empire. Kendrick finally reached the critics' table. He lowered the silver tray and began placing the dessert plates down one by one. I could see his mouth moving frantically as he delivered a rehearsed speech about the brilliant culinary vision of the legacy. He was trying hard to charm them, trying to spin a false narrative that the disastrous appetizers and ruined entrees were just opening night jitters and that this final dessert was the true perfect representation of their family brand. But at that exact moment, a man walked through the glass front doors of the restaurant. He was not dressed in a tuxedo or a designer gown like the rest of the angry patrons in the room. He wore a simple gray suit and carried a thick manila envelope in his right hand. He walked with total purpose and absolute authority. He bypassed the host stand, completely ignoring my father, who desperately tried to grab his arm. The man scanned the crowded dining room, his sharp eyes sweeping over the massive chaos until they locked directly onto Kendrick. Mateo kept the camera rolling as the man walked briskly across the floor, weaving through the tight tables. Kendrick was just picking up a small silver pitcher to pour the raspberry coulis over the chocolate spheres when the man in the gray suit stopped right behind his back. The man tapped Kendrick firmly on the shoulder. Kendrick spun around, his fake smile dropping into a look of pure annoyance. He clearly thought this was just another angry customer demanding a refund. "I am taking care of our most important guests right now," Kendrick snapped loudly. "You need to return to your table and wait for a manager." The man in the gray suit did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, but he spoke with a commanding clarity that completely cut through the ambient noise in the room. "Are you Kendrick Washington, acting chief financial officer of the Legacy Limited Liability Company?" the man asked. Kendrick stood up a little taller, proudly puffing out his chest in front of the important food critics. "Yes, I am," Kendrick replied arrogantly. The man immediately thrust the thick manila envelope directly into Kendrick's chest. "You have just been officially served," the man stated loudly and clearly. "By order of the Federal Court of the Northern District of Illinois, you are hereby presented with an emergency injunction for massive intellectual property theft and direct trademark infringement." The entire dining room seemed to freeze. The angry murmurs of the complaining guests suddenly died down as people turned their heads to watch the intense drama unfold. The four food critics sitting at the table instantly pulled out their digital voice recorders and small leather-bound notebooks. Their eyes were wide with predatory journalistic excitement. This was a story far juicier than a burned steak. Kendrick looked down at the heavy envelope in his hands as if it were a highly venomous snake. "What is this garbage?" Kendrick stammered, his confident facade crumbling into absolute panic. "What are you talking about right now? I own this restaurant." The process server took a large step back and loudly projected his voice so that every single person in the dining room, especially the hungry journalists, could hear every single word. "That document is a federal court order filed by the legal counsel of Chef Gemma. It explicitly details that every single recipe, menu item name, and unique plating design currently being offered in this establishment is her exclusive, federally trademarked intellectual property. You do not have the legal right to cook, serve, or profit from her original creations." The man pointed a sharp, accusing finger directly at the four beautiful dessert plates resting on the table in front of the eager critics. "The emergency injunction goes into effect immediately today. If you pour that sauce, if you serve that dessert, or if you attempt to sell even one more plate of her trademarked food tonight, your company will be penalized with a mandatory fine of $50,000 per plate." Kendrick stood completely frozen in absolute terror. He was holding the small silver pitcher of raspberry coulis in his violently trembling hand, hovering just a few inches above the chocolate spheres. He slowly did the terrifying mental math in his head. 4 plates of dessert multiplied by $50,000 meant he was holding $200,000 of instant legal liability right in his sweaty hands. His eyes darted frantically to the food critics who were rapidly scribbling down every single humiliating detail of his total public destruction. The lead critic, a woman with sharp glasses and zero patience, looked up at Kendrick with a devastating, confident smirk. "Well, Kendrick," the lead critic said loudly, "are you going to serve the dessert, or are you going to surrender completely?" Kendrick opened his trembling fingers and dropped the heavy silver pitcher onto the hard floor. The sweet red raspberry sauce splattered violently across his expensive leather shoes, pooling around his feet. Defeated and completely humiliated, he turned his back on the critics and ran toward the kitchen. The highly anticipated grand opening dinner service had completely collapsed into utter catastrophic ruin. The morning after the grand opening disaster was surprisingly quiet. I woke up feeling rested for the first time in months. The constant knot of anxiety that had lived in my stomach since I returned to Chicago was completely gone. I made myself a simple breakfast and sat by the window watching the city wake up. My phone had been blissfully silent since the news of the injunction dropped. I imagined my family was too busy dealing with the massive legal and financial fallout to bother harassing me. But right at 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I walked over and looked at the screen, expecting another angry message from my mother, or perhaps a pathetic apology from Kendrick. Instead, the message was from a number I had only texted once. It was Harrison. The message was brief and straight to the point. It read, "Meet me at the Reserve Roastery downtown in exactly 1 hour." There was no greeting and no explanation, but I knew exactly what I had to do. I quickly changed into a sharp tailored blazer and comfortable jeans, projecting an image of professional confidence rather than kitchen exhaustion. The drive downtown was smooth, and the crisp morning air felt invigorating. I handed my keys to the valet outside the massive glass doors of the upscale coffee shop. The Reserve Roastery was not your average neighborhood cafe. It was a sprawling multi-level temple to high-end coffee with gleaming brass espresso machines, roasted beans tumbling through overhead pneumatic tubes, and business executives conducting million-dollar deals over premium pour-overs. I spotted Harrison immediately. He was sitting at a private marble table tucked away in a quiet corner on the mezzanine level. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit with no tie, looking effortlessly powerful. A cup of black coffee sat in front of him, alongside a sleek leather portfolio. As I approached the table, he did not stand up, but he offered a genuine smile that I had never seen him use around my family. "Have a seat, Gemma," he said, gesturing to the leather chair opposite him. I sat down, placing my bag on the floor. A waiter appeared almost instantly, setting a perfectly crafted latte in front of me before quietly disappearing. I looked at Harrison, waiting for him to speak. I assumed he wanted to discuss the chaotic events of the previous evening, or perhaps ask me to drop the injunction against my family so he could recover some dignity. I was completely wrong. Harrison took a slow sip of his black coffee and leaned forward, resting his arms on the cool marble table. "I had a few of my associates dine at the Legacy last night," he began casually, as if we were discussing the weather. "They gave me a full detailed report of the dinner service. They told me about the raw chicken, the burnt steaks, and the absolute panic sweeping through the dining room. But my favorite part of the entire report was when a federal process server walked in and handed your completely incompetent brother-in-law an emergency court injunction right in front of the most powerful food critics in Chicago." Harrison let out a deep, genuine laugh. "It was a brilliant tactical move, Gemma. You completely outsmarted them, and you did it with absolute surgical precision." I felt a flush of pride, but I kept my expression carefully neutral. "I did what I had to do to protect my intellectual property." "Harrison," I replied evenly. "My family tried to steal a decade of my hard work and claim it as their own. I could not let that happen." Harrison nodded slowly, his sharp eyes studying my face. "You know, I never actually believed in their business plan," he said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "Your father, Richard, is a dinosaur who still thinks screaming at staff produces good food. Your mother, Patricia, only cares about the aesthetic of wealth, and your sister, Sloane, is a vanity project disguised as a human being. And Kendrick is quite possibly the most financially illiterate man I have ever had the misfortune of sitting across a boardroom table from." The man could not successfully balance a checkbook, let alone manage a multi-million-dollar restaurant budget. I stared at him in complete surprise. If you knew all of that, why were you sitting in our VIP dining room last night, holding a $10 million term sheet? I asked. Why were you willing to give them that kind of money if you knew they were destined to fail? Harrison smiled a cold, calculating smile. Because in venture capital, we do not invest in the messy family baggage, Gemma. We invest in the raw, undeniable talent. I knew from the very first time I tasted your food in New York that you were a generational talent. You have a gift that cannot be taught. When your family approached my firm for funding, I immediately ran a deep background check on their financials. I saw the massive red flags. I knew they were bleeding cash and lying about their projections. But I also knew they had you. Harrison continued, his gaze intense and unwavering. I knew you were the engine keeping that sinking ship afloat. My entire strategy was to wait. I wanted to see how long it would take for you to finally realize your own immense value and cut the dead weight. I was fully prepared to let them fail because I knew that once you walked away, you would be ready to build something truly spectacular on your own terms. Your text message last night proved to me that you finally possess the ruthless business instinct required to run an empire. Tearing up that contract in front of your sister was just my way of officially closing their chapter. I sat back in my chair, letting his words settle in my mind. He had played a massive strategic game, recognizing my worth long before I had fully recognized it myself. He saw my family as nothing more than a temporary obstacle in his path to acquiring my culinary genius. It was a staggering revelation, but it also felt incredibly validating. For my entire life, my family had made me feel like I was lucky to even be included in their plans. But sitting here across from a billionaire investor, I finally understood the truth. They were the ones who were lucky to have me, and they had foolishly thrown it all away for the sake of their own hollow egos. Harrison reached over and opened his sleek leather portfolio. He pulled out a thick stack of freshly printed legal documents and slid them across the smooth marble table until they rested right next to my coffee cup. This is a brand new term sheet, he announced quietly. It is the exact same $10 million investment I brought to the restaurant last night. But there is one very important difference. This contract does not mention the legacy. It does not mention Richard, Patricia Sloan, or Kendrick. This investment is entirely for you, Gemma. I looked down at the documents, my heart pounding a heavy rhythmic beat in my chest. You are offering me $10 million as the sole owner, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Harrison nodded firmly. Sole ownership, total creative control, and absolute authority over all operational decisions, he confirmed. I provide the capital and the real estate connections. You provide the menu, the vision, and the Michelin-level execution. We build a flagship restaurant that will completely redefine the Chicago culinary scene. No family drama, no incompetent management, just pure, unadulterated excellence. Do we have a deal? I did not need to think about it. I did not need to consult a financial advisor or ask for a few days to mull over the details. I had spent my entire adult life preparing for this exact moment. I had paid my dues in sweat burns and tears. I had survived the toxic manipulation of the people who were supposed to love me the most. And now, standing at the edge of my own brilliant future, I was absolutely ready to take total control. I looked Harrison right in the eye and reached for the expensive metal pen resting on top of the portfolio. I clicked the pen open and signed my name on the dotted line, sealing the deal on the spot. Walking out of the Reserve Roastery coffee shop with a signed $10 million investment contract in my leather bag felt entirely surreal. For my entire life, my family had conditioned me to believe that I was completely dependent on them for my survival in the culinary world. They told me I needed their business acumen and their social connections just to keep a roof over my head. But as I stepped out onto the busy Chicago sidewalk, feeling the cool breeze against my face, I realized they had it completely backwards. I was the golden goose, and I had finally broken out of their cage. Harrison did not just give me money, he gave me a massive team of elite professionals to help me build my empire. By noon that exact same day, his top real estate broker called my phone. The broker told me we needed to move incredibly fast to capitalize on the momentum of my sudden departure from the legacy. We spent the next 3 days touring available commercial spaces in the most affluent neighborhoods of the city. I desperately needed a space that matched the fierce, undeniable energy I was feeling inside my heart. I wanted a location that was not just a restaurant, but a massive, undeniable statement of my independence. On the fourth morning of our intense real estate search, my broker called me with a sense of urgent excitement in his voice. He told me a highly coveted property had just unexpectedly fallen out of escrow late the night before, and the frustrated landlord was highly motivated to sign a new tenant immediately. We drove out to see it that very same afternoon. As my car turned down the familiar upscale avenue, my heart began to beat a little faster. The broker pulled over and parked directly in front of a breathtaking modern building. It featured massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a beautiful open-concept floor plan, and a gorgeous wrap-around outdoor patio. But the most incredible feature of the property was not the high ceilings or the state-of-the-art commercial kitchen space in the back. The most incredible feature was the exact geographical location of the building. I stood on the wide concrete sidewalk, looking at the glass facade, and then I slowly turned around to look directly across the busy street. There, sitting exactly opposite my perfect new location, was the legacy. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was absolutely overwhelming. My family had deliberately chosen their location because it was the most visible, highly trafficked corner in the entire culinary district. They wanted to be seen by everyone. They wanted to stand as a monument to their own massive egos. And now the only available commercial space capable of rivaling their footprint was directly in their line of sight. I stood on the sidewalk and stared at the dark-tinted windows of my family restaurant. I could actually see the faint silhouette of Kendrick frantically pacing back and forth in the empty dining room, desperately trying to figure out how to save his collapsing business. I could see my father now standing near the front door, looking incredibly stressed and completely defeated. They were drowning in the catastrophic mess they had created for themselves. The real estate broker stood next to me, nervously checking his expensive watch. He looked across the street and then looked back at me, clearly waiting for my reaction. He knew the complex history of my sudden departure, and he carefully asked if being this close to my family would be a negative distraction for my creative process. I looked at the broker and smiled a bright, genuine smile. I told him it was not a distraction at all. I told him it was absolute destiny. I signed the massive commercial lease agreement right there on the hood of the broker's luxury sedan. With the full power of Harrison's $10 million backing, the entire transaction was completely seamless and finalized within 48 hours. I officially had the keys to my very own private kingdom. I immediately named my new restaurant Aura. The moment the lease was signed, I hired the best commercial construction crew in Chicago to begin the interior build-out. I was not going to cut a single corner. I ordered custom Italian leather seating, imported marble countertops, and the most advanced culinary equipment money could buy. I spent my days inside the glass building sketching out the new dining room layout and testing brilliant new flavor profiles in my pristine test kitchen. And every single time I looked up from my work, I had a crystal clear, unobstructed view of my family completely falling apart across the street. It was the ultimate psychological advantage. They had no idea I was the new tenant moving into the massive luxury space directly across from them. They were too busy fighting off creditors and dealing with the terrible fallout of the federal injunction to notice the intense construction activity happening right under their noses. But I knew I could not keep my identity a secret forever. In the fast-paced restaurant industry, generating pre-opening buzz is absolutely essential for a successful launch. I needed to announce my arrival to the city of Chicago, and I wanted to do it in the most spectacular and undeniable way possible. I contacted a premium commercial printing company and commissioned a massive custom vinyl banner. I gave them incredibly specific dimensions because I wanted the sign to cover the entire length of my second-floor glass windows. I did not want a subtle, elegant announcement. I wanted a massive, bold declaration of war. I gathered my entire construction crew in the main dining room and explained exactly what we were going to do. I hired a specialized rigging team with safety harnesses and heavy-duty cables to ensure the banner would be hung perfectly straight and totally secure against the strong Chicago wind. I scheduled the installation for exactly 5 o'clock in the evening. I chose that specific time for a very calculated reason. 5 o'clock was the exact moment when the setting sun hit the glass of my building and reflected directly into the main dining room of the Legacy, illuminating everything in a bright golden glow. As the clock struck 5, I stood proudly on the sidewalk and gave the signal to my crew. The massive roll of vinyl dropped down from the roof, unrolling smoothly over the expensive glass facade. The thick, bold black letters printed against a brilliant white background were impossible to miss. The massive banner proudly declared, "Coming soon, Chef Gemma." Then I slowly turned my gaze across the street. Through the windows of the Legacy, I saw my mother Patricia freeze completely in her tracks. I saw Sloane drop a stack of menus onto the floor. I saw my father and Kendrick rush to their front glass windows, staring in absolute horrified disbelief at the massive sign dominating their view. They thought they could erase me from the industry, but instead I had built a towering fortress of success right on their front doorstep. The massive banner hanging from the front of my new restaurant building was like a giant mirror reflecting my family's total failure right back into their faces. According to my friend Matteo, my loyal informant still working in the dish pit across the street, the reaction inside the Legacy was absolute pure pandemonium. The moment the heavy vinyl rolled down and revealed my name in bold black letters, my mother Patricia literally dropped a tray of expensive crystal wine glasses right onto the hardwood floor. The shattering sound echoed through their empty dining room, a perfect metaphor for their collapsing empire. Sloane completely lost whatever tiny shred of composure she had left. Matteo texted me that my sister began pacing frantically in circles, screaming at my father, and Kendrick blaming them for letting me secure the lease. She was completely hysterical. She realized that my new restaurant aura was not just going to compete with them, it was going to completely obliterate them. Every single patron walking past their failed establishment would look across the street and see a glittering, fully booked Michelin-level dining experience with my name proudly displayed on the glass. The sheer panic over their impending public humiliation drove Patricia and Sloane into a state of absolute desperate madness. They knew they could not compete with my talent. They knew they could not win a legal battle against my federal trademarks. Their fragile egos could not handle the idea of watching me succeed right on their doorstep. So instead of focusing on fixing their own terrible menu or paying their deeply frustrated staff, my mother and my sister decided to resort to straight criminal behavior to stop me. What Patricia and Sloane failed to realize is that I spent my entire life studying their toxic psychology. I knew exactly how they operated when they felt backed into a corner. They always lashed out. They always played dirty. Because I anticipated their desperate retaliation, I had taken extreme precautions the very first day I signed the commercial lease. I did not just hire a standard night watchman. I invested $30,000 into a military-grade state-of-the-art security system. My entire restaurant was wired with invisible high-definition 4K infrared cameras. These were not cheap, blurry convenience store cameras. These lenses could capture the exact serial number on a dollar bill in total pitch-black darkness. They had motion sensors, audio recording capabilities, and facial recognition tracking that instantly beamed a live feed directly to my mobile phone and backed up securely to an encrypted cloud server. I had carefully positioned the most advanced cameras directly over my brand-new custom-built commercial ovens. These ovens were the absolute beating heart of my new kitchen, imported directly from Italy, and worth tens of thousands of dollars each. I knew that if my family wanted to hurt me financially and delay my grand opening, they would target my most expensive equipment. I went to bed that night feeling a strange mix of deep exhaustion and high-alert anticipation. I left my phone resting on my nightstand with the volume turned all the way up, waiting for the inevitable trap to spring. I made sure the security technicians hid the camera lenses flawlessly within the ceiling panels and behind the ventilation ducts so they were completely undetectable to the naked eye. The front doors had reinforced smart locks, but I specifically instructed the contractors to leave the heavy steel alley door with a standard manual deadbolt. I wanted my family to think they could easily bypass my security if they were desperate enough to try. I wanted to give them enough rope to hang themselves. At exactly 2 in the morning, my phone screen suddenly lit up the dark bedroom. A loud piercing digital chime broke the absolute silence of my apartment. I sat up immediately, my heart pounding a steady rhythm against my ribs. I picked up the phone and saw a bright red notification banner across the screen. It was an alert from the security application warning me of multiple motion detections near the rear alley entrance of my restaurant. I did not call the police. I did not panic. I simply pressed my thumb against the screen, unlocked the application, and opened the live high-definition video feed. The infrared camera switched on, bathing the dark alleyway in a crisp, ghostly white glow. Sure enough, two familiar figures were creeping slowly toward my back door. It was my mother, Patricia, and my sister, Sloane. They were dressed in dark athletic clothing, looking completely ridiculous as they tried to play the roles of stealthy criminals. They both wore black gloves, and Patricia was carrying a heavy metal crowbar. Sloane was struggling to carry two massive, heavy plastic jugs. I zoomed in on the high-definition feed and easily read the bold warning labels on the sides of the jugs. It was highly corrosive industrial-strength bleach, the kind of toxic chemical used to deep clean raw sewage pipes. If poured into the delicate internal gas lines and expensive ventilation fans of my imported ovens, the bleach would instantly strip the metal completely, destroy the internal mechanics, and permanently contaminate the cooking surfaces. It would ruin the equipment and easily delay my grand opening by 3 entire months. I watched in total fascination from the safety of my bed as my mother jammed the metal crowbar into the gap of the heavy steel alley door. With a loud, strained grunt that the sensitive audio microphones picked up perfectly, she managed to pry the lock open. The door swung wide, and the two women quickly slipped inside my pristine, brand-new kitchen. The interior cameras immediately began tracking their every single movement. The 4K resolution was so incredibly sharp that I could clearly see the terrified sweat beading on my sister's forehead. I could hear their frantic, hushed whispers echoing off the stainless steel prep tables. Sloane frantically whispered to our mother that they needed to hurry before a security patrol drove by the building. Patricia harshly shushed her, instructing her to unscrew the caps of the industrial bleach. They walked directly over to my beautiful, expensive Italian ovens. My mother pointed a gloved finger at the main ventilation grates, gesturing for Sloane to pour the toxic chemicals directly down into the delicate machinery. They honestly believed they were executing a brilliant, untraceable master plan. They thought the darkness of the room was completely hiding their identities and their massive felony property damage. They had absolutely no idea that invisible infrared beams were currently mapping their faces in crystal-clear, high definition. They had no idea that every single word of their malicious conspiracy was being permanently recorded and saved to a remote server. As Sloane tipped the heavy plastic jug forward and the thick toxic bleach began to slowly pour into my equipment, they both smiled malicious, wicked smiles. They thought they had finally won. They thought they had successfully destroyed my dream and saved their fragile egos. I smiled back at my glowing phone screen, watching the exact moment my mother and sister willingly handed me the ultimate weapon for their total destruction. I sat in the dark glow of my bedroom, watching the incredibly clear security footage loop over and over again on my phone screen. Any normal person would have immediately dialed the police to report a massive felony in progress. If I called the authorities right then, my mother Patricia and my sister Sloane would have been arrested on the spot. They would have been handcuffed, dragged out of my beautiful new kitchen, and thrown into a cold holding cell before the sun even came up. But I did not dial emergency services. I knew that simply sending them to jail would allow my family to somehow spin the narrative. They would hire expensive lawyers, play the victims, and claim I set them up. I did not want them to just face a judge in a courtroom. I wanted them to face each other. I wanted to completely shatter the delicate, toxic illusion that held our family together. I wanted my father Richard to see exactly what his precious golden child and his enabling wife were actually doing while he was desperately trying to save his collapsing restaurant. I carefully exported the high-definition video file from my security application. The infrared camera had captured every single agonizing detail with absolutely flawless clarity. You could clearly see the distinctive designer logo on Sloane's dark athletic jacket. You could perfectly hear the hollow plastic sound of the industrial bleach jugs hitting the stainless steel prep tables. And most importantly, you could see their wicked, arrogant smiles as they poured the highly toxic chemicals directly into my expensive, imported Italian ovens. I trimmed the video clip down to the most damning 2 minutes of footage, ensuring the file size was small enough to send over a cellular network, but long enough to show their undeniable guilt. I wanted the evidence to be completely bulletproof. Then I opened my text messaging application and navigated to the family group chat. It was a chat thread I had muted months ago, a place usually reserved for my mother, boasting about Sloane's minor accomplishments or my father complaining about his staff. I took a deep breath, feeling an immense surge of absolute power. I attached the pristine video file to the message thread. I watched the small blue progress bar slowly fill across the screen as the heavy footage uploaded to the group chat. Once the video was successfully attached, I tapped my fingers against the glass keyboard and typed a very simple, highly calculated message. I did not write a long emotional paragraph about how deeply they had betrayed me. I did not ask them why they hated me so much. I did not demand a fake apology. I simply typed smile for the camera. Pay for the damages by noon, or this goes to the local news. I pressed send and watched the message pop up in the chat thread. Within seconds, I saw the small digital indicators confirming that the message had been delivered and read by Richard, Patricia, Sloane, and Kendrick. The trap was officially sprung. I placed my phone face up on the nightstand and waited for the inevitable explosion to reach my apartment all the way from across the city. The silence only lasted for about 45 seconds before my phone completely erupted, but the calls were not coming to my phone. They were calling each other. My loyal informant, Matteo, was already working the early morning prep shift across the street at the Legacy. He immediately started sending me a rapid-fire string of text messages describing the absolute chaos unfolding inside their restaurant office. According to Matteo, my father Richard had received the video while sitting at his desk trying to review the disastrous opening night financial ledgers. When he opened the video and saw his wife and his youngest daughter committing a massive felony right across the street, he completely lost his mind. Richard was a proud, arrogant man, but he was not a criminal. He knew that commercial property damage of that magnitude carried a mandatory prison sentence. Matteo texted me that Richard stormed out of the office and completely exploded at Patricia and Sloane right in the middle of the empty dining room. For the first time in her entire life, Sloane was not being coddled or protected by our father. Richard screamed at them so loudly that the few remaining kitchen staff members actually stopped prepping food to watch the massive fight. He demanded to know what they were thinking. He yelled that they had just handed me the ultimate weapon to destroy their entire family. Kendrick was standing nearby, completely hyperventilating. Kendrick was already facing a massive financial penalty for violating my federal trademarks the night before. Now his wife and mother-in-law had just committed a highly documented felony that could bring the local news media and the police crashing down on their heads by lunchtime. Kendrick started screaming at Sloane, calling her a massive idiot for not checking for cameras. Sloane started sobbing hysterically, blaming our mother for coming up with the horrible plan. Patricia tried to defend herself, but Richard aggressively shut her down, shouting that she had finally ruined them all. They were entirely turning on each other, completely tearing their fake family loyalty apart. The empire they tried to steal from me was rapidly burning to the ground from the inside out, and I was holding the match. This was the true victory. I did not just want to punish them for their terrible actions. I wanted them to experience the exact same feeling of absolute helplessness they had forced upon me for my entire life. I wanted them to realize that their arrogant actions had severe, devastating consequences. They thought they could sneak into the dark and ruin my life without anyone ever knowing the truth. But now the truth was out, and they were entirely at my mercy, waiting for their inevitable, absolute destruction. The fallout from the security camera footage was immediate and incredibly expensive for my family. My mother and sister had caused nearly $80,000 in damages to my imported ovens. I gave them a strict deadline to pay the invoice or face the police. Out of terror of going to prison, they actually paid it. But I knew the financial reality of their situation. I knew their operating accounts were already completely drained from the disastrous grand opening and the massive loss of the $10 million investment. Paying my damage bill was the final nail in their financial coffin. The legacy was now rapidly bleeding cash every single day. Their dining room was empty during prime dinner hours. The wealthy patrons of Chicago had abandoned them after reading the devastating reviews from the food critics. However, the restaurant still had massive overhead costs. They had to pay for electricity and the wages of a kitchen staff that was standing around doing absolutely nothing. Kendrick was drowning. As the acting chief financial officer, he was responsible for making sure the payroll checks cleared by the end of the week. If the staff did not get paid, they would all walk out and the business would officially shut down. Kendrick could not let that happen. His massive ego simply could not handle the public humiliation of declaring bankruptcy less than 2 weeks after opening. So instead of admitting defeat and asking my father for help, Kendrick decided to cross a massive legal boundary. Kendrick needed cash immediately, and no reputable bank in the city would approve a commercial loan for a failing restaurant with zero revenue. He was forced to turn to the shadowy world of predatory lenders. These were aggressive private lending firms that charged incredibly high interest rates and required massive collateral to secure the cash. Kendrick knew he had absolutely no personal assets to his name. He leased his expensive car, and he rented his high-end downtown apartment. He had absolutely nothing of value to offer the lenders. But my parents did. Richard and Patricia owned a beautiful, sprawling 4-bedroom retirement home in a wealthy suburb of the city. They had worked their entire lives to pay off that mortgage. It was their ultimate safety net. Kendrick knew exactly where my father kept his sensitive financial documents in the back office of the restaurant. Late one night, while my father was desperately trying to manage the failing dinner service, Kendrick snuck into the office and accessed the property deeds. Without a single ounce of hesitation, Kendrick applied for a massive high-interest predatory loan using my parents' fully paid-off retirement home as the sole collateral. When the digital paperwork required an official signature from the property owner, Kendrick casually forged my father's name. He committed massive financial fraud and wire fraud in one single evening, completely gambling my parents' entire financial future just to cover payroll and save his own fake corporate image. While Kendrick was busy committing serious federal crimes across the street, I was entirely focused on the future. My new restaurant was rapidly coming together. The construction crew had fully repaired the minor damage to my ovens, and my completely loyal staff was busy prepping the kitchen for our upcoming launch. I was sitting at my new stainless steel desk, reviewing wholesale ingredient orders, when my mobile phone suddenly rang. I looked at the screen and smiled. The caller ID showed the name of my primary wholesale meat supplier. He was a tough, no-nonsense guy who sourced the absolute best premium cuts of beef in the entire Midwest region. We had worked together for years, and we had a mutual respect. I answered the phone expecting to discuss the delivery schedule for my opening week, but he did not call to talk about my orders. He called because he was absolutely furious with my family. He told me that he had just officially cut off all deliveries to the legacy. I leaned back in my chair and listened intently as he explained the entire situation. He said Kendrick had placed a massive premium meat order earlier in the week, promising to pay the invoice upon delivery. But when the delivery trucks arrived and processed the payment, the corporate checks completely bounced. There were absolutely no funds available in the restaurant bank account. My supplier was not the kind of man who simply walked away from an unpaid bill. He told me he immediately hired a private collection investigator to run a background check on the legacy. He wanted to know what kind of assets the company held so he could force a legal collection on his unpaid invoices. What the investigator found was absolutely shocking. My supplier told me the investigator pulled the public property records for my parents and discovered a massive new lien placed against their suburban retirement home. The loan had been finalized and recorded just 2 days ago through a notorious private lending firm known for ruthless foreclosure tactics. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind. I knew my father, Richard. He was a deeply conservative man when it came to personal finances. He would absolutely never mortgage his fully paid-off dream home to fund a failing restaurant. He would have closed the doors and cut his losses first. There was only one person desperate enough, arrogant enough, and completely stupid enough to take out a predatory loan like that. Kendrick. My brother-in-law illegally forged the documents and secretly mortgaged my parents' entire future to cover up his own massive failures. I sincerely thanked my supplier for the critical information and ended the phone call. I sat in my office staring out the window at the failing restaurant across the street. Kendrick thought he had bought himself some extra time. He had absolutely no idea that I now held the exact paperwork that would send him directly to federal prison. The massive aisles of the commercial restaurant supply store were brightly lit and completely packed with towering shelves of bulk ingredients and heavy-duty cooking equipment. I was walking down the central aisle pushing a heavy flatbed cart loaded with premium imported olive oils, specialty finishing salts, and high-end ceramic platingware for my upcoming grand opening. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was feeling incredibly productive. Aura was just weeks away from officially opening its doors, and my entire management team was firing on all cylinders. I had just finished finalizing my opening week vegetable orders with a local organic farming collective, and I was in a fantastic mood. The supply store was usually a sanctuary for me, a place where I could get lost in the endless possibilities of new culinary creations. But as I turned the corner into the bulk dry goods section, my peaceful shopping trip was abruptly interrupted. Standing right in the middle of the aisle staring blankly at a massive shelf of cheap generic flour was my father, Richard. He looked completely exhausted. His usually perfect posture was slumped, and the tailored suit he normally wore had been replaced by a wrinkled button-down shirt. His shopping cart was a pathetic reflection of the current desperate state of his failing business. Instead of premium ingredients, he was loading up on the absolute cheapest bulk items available, clearly trying to cut corners to save whatever pennies he had left. I tried to silently turn my cart around and walk the other way, but the heavy wheels squeaked loudly on the polished concrete floor. Richard immediately snapped his head up and locked eyes with me. For a brief second, I saw genuine exhaustion in his face, but it was quickly replaced by his trademark blinding arrogance. He abandoned his cart and marched directly toward me, blocking my path entirely. I stopped pushing my flatbed and looked at him, maintaining a completely neutral expression. I expected him to scream at me about the security camera footage or the federal injunction. I expected him to demand that I pay for his ruined dinner service. But Richard was a man who lived completely inside his own severe delusions. Instead of acknowledging the massive disasters he had caused, he decided to take the moral high ground and deliver a self-righteous lecture. He crossed his arms over his chest and looked down at my cart full of expensive supplies with a deep sneer of ultimate absolute disgust. "Look at you," Richard scoffed loudly, his voice echoing down the empty aisle. "You think you have won, do you not? You think that just because you stole our investor and played dirty legal tricks, you are somehow a massive success? You have absolutely no idea how the real business world actually works, Gemma." He took a step closer, pointing a finger directly at my face. "Family loyalty is the only thing that actually matters in this industry. When you turn your back on your own flesh and blood, you curse yourself to total failure. The legacy is just experiencing a minor rough patch right now, but we will bounce back stronger than ever because we actually stick together. We are a unified family." You are just a selfish, bitter little girl playing restaurant with a stolen checkbook. When your shiny new place completely fails and your fake friends abandon you, do not come crying to my doorstep asking for a job. You made your bed, and now you are going to die in it alone. I stood there and listened to his entire pathetic speech without interrupting him once. I just let him keep talking and digging his own massive grave. He genuinely believed his own lies. He thought his unified family was going to somehow magically save him. When he finally finished his arrogant lecture and stood there waiting for me to cry or apologize, I simply smiled at him. It was not a warm smile, but a cold, calculating expression of pure, absolute victory. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the thick stack of financial documents my meat supplier had secretly forwarded to me that very morning. I held the papers tightly in my right hand. I am not going to come crying to your doorstep, Dad, I said, my voice perfectly calm and completely steady. Mostly because you do not actually own a doorstep anymore. I reached forward and aggressively slapped the heavy stack of legal paperwork directly onto the metal basket of his shopping cart. The loud smack echoed sharply in the quiet store. Richard flinched and looked down at the documents in total confusion. I suggest you read the second page, I instructed him coldly. Richard picked up the papers with trembling hands. His eyes scanned the bold black text at the top of the page. It was the official recorded deed of trust for a massive high-interest predatory loan. As his eyes moved down the page, he saw the exact address of his beautiful, fully paid-off suburban retirement home listed as the primary collateral. And then he saw his own signature forged perfectly at the bottom of the legal agreement. The remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like an absolute ghost. "What is this?" he whispered, his voice cracking with pure terror. I leaned in very close to him, making sure he heard every single word I said. "Your fake chief financial officer son-in-law just illegally mortgaged your entire retirement home because Sloan cannot even boil an egg. You are completely bankrupt, Dad, and the bank is going to take your house by the end of the month. I hope you have a really great day." I then pushed my heavy cart right past him, leaving him standing frozen in the aisle, completely paralyzed by the horrifying realization that his golden child and her fraudulent husband had just made him entirely homeless. The opening night of Aura was nothing short of absolute pure magic. I stood in the center of my massive state-of-the-art kitchen, taking a deep breath of the incredible aromas filling the air. The scent of toasted hazelnut, seared premium wagyu beef, and rich dark chocolate ganache swirled around me. For the first time in my entire culinary career, I was not cooking under the suffocating shadow of my family. I was not hiding in a hot basement prep kitchen while my sister Sloane took all the credit for my hard work. I was the executive chef and the sole owner of the most highly anticipated restaurant in Chicago. The dining room was completely packed with the most influential people in the city. Harrison had used his massive network of venture capital connections to invite A-list celebrities, prominent politicians, and elite socialites. My reservation book was completely filled for the next 6 solid months. The energy in the building was electric. The custom Italian leather booths were filled with people laughing and enjoying the flawless service provided by my dedicated staff. I walked out of the kitchen and stepped onto the main dining floor, feeling an overwhelming sense of pride and absolute vindication. The food critics who had ruthlessly destroyed the legacy just a few weeks prior were sitting at my absolute best table. The lead critic who had demanded the dessert from Kendrick was now smiling warmly as my servers placed my signature dishes in front of her. She took a single bite of the wagyu tartare, closed her eyes, and slowly nodded in absolute perfect culinary bliss. I walked over to their table to personally welcome them to Aura. They did not treat me like the hired help or a background character. They stood up and shook my hand, calling me a true visionary and praising my incredible resilience. Harrison was sitting at the bar, sipping a rare vintage bourbon, looking incredibly satisfied with his $10 million investment. He raised his glass to me from across the room, acknowledging our massive shared victory. Everything I had ever dreamed of was finally coming true right in front of my eyes. I had taken the worst betrayal of my entire life and transformed it into a towering empire of absolute success. But the most beautiful part of the entire evening was not the celebrities or the glowing praise from the food critics. The most beautiful part was the incredible contrast happening exactly directly across the street. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows of my bustling dining room, I had a perfect unobstructed view of my family restaurant. The Legacy was completely entirely dark. There were no valet attendants standing on the curb. There were no wealthy patrons laughing in the entryway. The beautiful, expensive chandeliers my mother Patricia had meticulously picked out were completely turned off, casting the entire building into deep, gloomy shadows. Earlier that afternoon, my loyal informant Mateo had sent me the final devastating update. The predatory loan Kendrick had illegally taken out against my parents' retirement home had temporarily covered the massive property damage he owed me, but it was not nearly enough to save their sinking ship. When Friday morning arrived and the kitchen staff lined up to receive their weekly wages, Kendrick's corporate checks had completely bounced again. Mateo told me the staff had finally reached their breaking point. They refused to prep a single vegetable or wash a single dish until they were paid in full with actual cash. Kendrick tried to scream at them and threaten them with legal action, but his fake corporate intimidation tactics completely failed. The entire staff, including the replacement head chef, simultaneously took off their aprons, threw them directly onto Kendrick's expensive leather shoes, and walked right out the front door. They abandoned the restaurant just hours before the weekend dinner service was supposed to begin. Without a kitchen staff and without any money to buy fresh ingredients, my father Richard was forced to manually lock the front doors and turn off the open sign. He had to stand in the dark, empty dining room and personally call every single reservation to cancel their dinners. He had to listen to angry customers yell at him over the phone, while his fraudulent son-in-law panicked in the back office, and his golden child daughter cried about her ruined social media reputation. They were entirely ruined. I stood near the host stand of Aura watching the dark silhouette of the Legacy across the street. The juxtaposition was almost too perfect to be real. On my side of the street, there was brilliant light, incredible wealth, and the joyous sounds of a massive success. On their side of the street, there was nothing but dark, empty failure. They had tried to push me down so they could easily climb to the top. They had treated me like a useless burden while simultaneously stealing my talent to fund their expensive vanity project. Now they were sitting in the pitch-black ruins of their own massive, arrogant mistakes. I watched a few confused people walk up to the dark doors of the Legacy, pull on the locked handles, and then immediately turn around to look at my brightly lit restaurant. The foot traffic they so desperately wanted was literally crossing the street and walking directly through my front doors instead. I felt a deep, profound sense of closure. I did not need to scream or yell or throw a temper tantrum to win this war. I simply needed to let their own toxic incompetence completely destroy them. Watching the dark building, I saw a small movement near their front entrance. The glass door slowly pushed open, and a solitary figure stepped out onto the cold concrete sidewalk. Even from across the street, I instantly recognized my father Richard. He stood alone in the rain, looking up at the massive banner displaying my name. The rain started falling just after 8 o'clock. It was not a gentle drizzle, but a massive torrential downpour that quickly flooded the gutters of the Chicago streets. Inside the dining room of Aura, the atmosphere remained completely warm and inviting. The soft amber lighting reflected off the polished marble floors, and the low hum of joyful conversation filled the air. I stood near the host stand, taking a moment to simply breathe and appreciate the incredible success of my opening night. But my eyes inevitably drifted back to the massive glass windows at the front of the restaurant. Across the street, the Legacy was barely visible through the heavy sheets of rain. The building was completely dark and abandoned, looking like a haunted house in the middle of a vibrant city. And standing right on the edge of the sidewalk, entirely unprotected from the freezing rain, was my father Richard. He was not wearing an expensive trench coat or holding an umbrella. He was just standing there in his ruined suit, getting completely soaked as he stared up at the glowing lights of my restaurant. I watched him hesitate for a long moment. Then he slowly stepped off the curb and began to cross the busy street, dodging the headlights of passing cars. I knew exactly where he was going. I signaled to my head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man, to stand down and simply watch the front entrance. I wanted to see exactly what my father was going to do. The heavy glass doors of Aura slowly pushed open, and Richard stepped into the glittering, pristine lobby. The transformation in his physical appearance was absolutely staggering. Just a few weeks ago, he was a man who walked into my hot kitchen and aggressively ripped my chef apron off my neck. He used to carry himself with an inflated sense of absolute superiority, acting like he owned the entire culinary world. Now he looked incredibly small and completely broken. His expensive tailored suit was absolutely ruined, sticking to his thin frame. His gray hair was plastered to his forehead, and rainwater dripped steadily from his chin onto my spotless marble floor. The elegant host standing at the front podium immediately stepped forward to intercept him, assuming he was just a confused vagrant seeking shelter from the massive storm. But before the host could politely ask him to leave, I stepped forward and raised my hand. I walked slowly across the lobby until I was standing just a few feet away from the man who had tormented me for my entire life. Richard looked up at me, and for the first time in 33 years, there was absolutely no anger or arrogance in his eyes. There was only pure, absolute desperation. He was shivering violently from the cold rain, but I knew the trembling was also coming from a place of deep, psychological shock. "Gemma," he whispered, his voice cracking and barely audible over the sound of the restaurant chatter. I did not say anything. I just stood there in my crisp, clean chef coat, projecting absolute authority and waiting for him to speak. He looked around the beautiful, packed dining room. He saw the wealthy patrons, the happy servers, and the absolute perfection of my vision coming to life. He noticed the prominent food critics sitting at the best tables, smiling and enjoying the food he once tried to steal. He realized in that exact moment that everything I had built was entirely based on my own raw talent and hard work. A single tear rolled down his cheek, mixing with the cold rainwater. "You were right," he admitted, his voice shaking uncontrollably. "You were right about absolutely everything. Kendrick completely ruined us. He forged my signature on a predatory loan, and the bank just called me this afternoon. They are freezing all of our personal accounts, and they are officially foreclosing on the house on Monday morning. We have absolutely no money left, Gemma. The kitchen staff walked out on us tonight, and your mother is sitting in the dark office crying because she does not know where we are going to sleep next week." I stood perfectly still and listened to his pathetic, desperate confession without showing a single ounce of sympathy or emotion on my face. He had spent my entire childhood aggressively telling me that I was never good enough, and now he was standing right here in my magnificent lobby, freely admitting that his perfect golden family had completely and utterly destroyed themselves. He took a shaky step forward and reached out a trembling hand, as if he wanted to hold my arm, but he stopped himself. He looked down at his muddy shoes ruining the pristine marble floor, and then looked back up at me with absolute defeat. "Please, Gemma," he begged, his voice breaking completely. "I know I have made terrible mistakes. I know I treated you horribly, and I am so incredibly sorry, but we are still family. I need your help. Just give us a table for tonight so I can show your mother that there is still some hope. Or please, just give me a job. I will do absolutely anything you ask me to do starting right now. I will manage your inventory. I will sweep your floors. I will wash your dishes in the back. I just need a paycheck to keep my wife from becoming completely homeless." He started sobbing very quietly, right there in the exact middle of my busy lobby, ignoring the strange looks from the wealthy patrons waiting patiently for their tables. He simply did not care about his pride anymore because his pride had literally cost him his entire livelihood. "I really used to be a very good businessman, Gemma. I can really help you run this place. Please do not turn your back on your own father when he has absolutely nothing left in the world." I stood in the center of the magnificent lobby of Aura, looking at the man who had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. Richard was shivering violently, leaving a puddle of cold rainwater on the imported Italian marble floor. The beautiful ambient music of the restaurant and the joyful sounds of my wealthy patrons seemed to fade entirely into the background. For a brief moment, the entire world shrank down to just the two of us standing face to face. A heavy silence hung in the air between us. Any other daughter might have felt a sudden rush of overwhelming guilt or a deep biological instinct to immediately comfort her crying father. Any other daughter might have looked at this broken, pathetic old man and forgotten the decades of severe emotional abuse, the blatant favoritism, and the endless cruel remarks. But I was not just any daughter anymore. I was a woman who had been forged in the absolute fires of their relentless toxicity. I looked at his tears, and I did not feel a single drop of pity. I only felt a cold, profound sense of absolute clarity. He was not crying because he realized he was a terrible father. He was crying because he had finally run out of other people to exploit. "Gemma, please," he begged again, taking a step closer, but keeping his muddy shoes firmly planted near the entrance. "You have built something so incredibly beautiful here. You have more money and more success than we ever even dreamed of having across the street. You do not need to hold on to this deep anger anymore. We are your family. Your mother, Patricia, is sitting in the dark right now, terrified of losing her home. Your sister Sloane is completely devastated. We are all suffering so much right now. Just show a little bit of mercy. I can be a good employee for you. I can help you manage this massive operation. I know the restaurant business better than anyone else in Chicago. Give me a chance to prove that I can be the father you always wanted me to be. Just one table tonight or one small job tomorrow. That is all I am asking for to save our family from complete ruin." I listened to his desperate words and I felt a bitter smile slowly form on my lips. He was still trying to manipulate me even when he had absolutely nothing left to his name. He was trying to weaponize my own success against me, suggesting that because I was now incredibly wealthy, I had some kind of moral obligation to save them from their own massive mistakes. He was using my mother and my sister as human shields, hoping my conscience would force me to rescue the very women who tried to pour industrial bleach into my ovens just a few weeks ago. I looked closely at his desperate face, remembering the countless times I had begged for his approval. I remembered working 14-hour shifts with severe burns on my arms, just hoping he would say he was proud of me. I remembered the night he violently ripped my apron off my neck and told me to stay in the kitchen so his golden child could steal the spotlight. He never cared about my talent until it became profitable for him. He never cared about my feelings until his own feelings were completely crushed by the massive weight of his terrible decisions. He did not love me. He loved the convenient safety net I had always provided for his fragile ego. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the physical distance between us. The host and my security guard watched closely, ready to intervene at the slightest signal. I kept my voice incredibly low, so only my father could hear the absolute finality in my words. "You are not sorry for what you did to me, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of any emotion. "You are only sorry that Kendrick turned out to be exactly the kind of massive fraud I always knew he was. You are sorry that you bet your entire life savings on Sloane, and she could not even manage to keep the lights on for a single month. You stood in my kitchen and you treated me like I was nothing more than the hired help. You tried to steal my recipes, my hard work, and my entire future just to feed your massive ego. When Kendrick threatened to bankrupt me and sue me into total oblivion, you stood right beside him and smiled. You watched Sloane try to completely destroy my public reputation on social media, and you did not say a single word to stop her. You made your choices very clearly." Richard opened his mouth to argue, but the words completely failed him. He knew every single thing I said was the absolute, undeniable truth. I looked at him one last time, feeling the final remaining threads of our toxic family bond snap completely. "Stay in the kitchen, Dad," I asked, throwing his own terrible words right back into his face. "No. This is my empire now, and there is absolutely no room for you here." I raised my hand and made a precise signal to the tall security guard standing nearby. The guard stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on my father's wet shoulder. "It is time to leave, sir," the guard stated in a deep voice. Richard did not fight back. The ultimate rejection had drained the last drops of fight from him. He lowered his head, his shoulders shaking with fresh sobs as the guard slowly turned him around. I stood in the warm light of my magnificent lobby and watched my father get escorted right back out into the freezing cold rain. I turned my back on the dark street forever and walked confidently back into my bright, beautiful future. 6 months passed since the night my father walked out of my lobby and back into the freezing rain. Half a year might not seem like a very long time in the grand scheme of a normal life, but in the restaurant industry, it is an entire lifetime. During those 6 months, Aura did not just survive, it completely thrived beyond my wildest expectations. We received our first major culinary award from a prestigious national magazine, and the waiting list for a weekend reservation stretched out to nearly a full year. Every single morning I woke up with a profound sense of absolute peace. I was no longer waking up in a cold panic, worrying about my family constantly undermining my authority or secretly stealing my hard-earned recipes. I had completely cut the toxic anchor from my life, and I was finally sailing forward entirely on my own terms. But while my star was rapidly rising into the stratosphere, the entire world across the street was violently crashing down into absolute complete ruin. The Legacy officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy just 3 weeks after their disastrous opening night. Without a dedicated kitchen staff and without my federally trademarked menu, they had absolutely nothing left to sell to the public. The bank did not hesitate to completely freeze their corporate accounts. But the financial destruction did not stop at the business level. Because Kendrick had illegally forged my father's signature on that massive predatory loan, the private lenders aggressively moved forward with the foreclosure of my parents' beautiful suburban retirement home. Richard and Patricia lost the house they had lived in for 3 decades. The massive 4-bedroom colonial with the perfectly manicured lawn and the heated swimming pool was auctioned off by the bank to recover the stolen funds. My parents were completely stripped of their wealth and their elite social status. They were forced to pack whatever belongings they could fit into a few cardboard boxes and move into a tiny rented 2-bedroom apartment on the extreme outskirts of the city. There were no more country club dinners or expensive charity galas for Patricia. There was only the harsh, bitter reality of surviving on a fixed minimal income and dealing with the massive public shame of their total collapse. But Richard and Patricia were not the only ones paying a massive price for their incredible arrogance. The federal authorities eventually caught up with Kendrick. The private lending firm realized they had been defrauded, and they immediately contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Kendrick was officially indicted on multiple federal charges of massive wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. The man who used to strut around my kitchen in custom-tailored suits pretending to be a financial genius was currently sitting in a cold holding cell waiting for a criminal trial that would likely send him to federal prison for a very long time. His fraudulent corporate facade was completely shattered. And then there was my sister Sloane. Her precious social media empire completely died overnight. When the news of the intellectual property lawsuit and the massive bankruptcy hit the local papers, her thousands of followers quickly realized she was nothing more than a giant fraud. Her comment sections were completely flooded with angry patrons, calling her out for stealing my work and lying on camera. She tried to post a few more tearful videos playing the victim, but the internet had already completely moved on. Brands dropped her sponsorships instantly. With absolutely no kitchen skills, no college degree, and a completely ruined public reputation, Sloane was forced to face the real world for the very first time in her pampered life. Mateo told me he recently saw her working a minimum-wage retail job at a discount clothing store folding cheap sweaters, just trying to afford her basic weekly groceries. The final piece of their ruined empire was the restaurant building itself. For 6 long months, the massive glass front space directly across the street from Aura sat completely empty and entirely dark. The beautiful chandeliers gathered thick dust, and the expensive Italian leather chairs were sold off to pay a fraction of the remaining corporate debts. The massive banner with my name still hung proudly on my building, reflecting brightly in their dark, dirty windows every single evening. Finally, the primary commercial bank that held the original mortgage on the legacy building made their official move. They officially foreclosed on the prime real estate property, completely wiping out any remaining legal claim my family had to the building. It was the ultimate definitive end to their incredibly short-lived, arrogant dream. But a prime commercial location in the heart of the Chicago culinary district does not stay empty for very long. The bank immediately announced they were putting the massive building up for a public commercial auction. They wanted to liquidate the property as quickly as possible to recover their massive financial losses. The auction was scheduled for a bright Tuesday morning right on the front steps of the county courthouse. Investors and wealthy restaurateurs from all over the Midwest were already gathering their financial portfolios, preparing to aggressively bid on the highly coveted real estate. Everyone in the city wanted to own the massive building directly across the street from the incredibly successful Chef Gemma. They all saw it as a massive golden opportunity. But what none of those wealthy investors knew was that I had already called my incredibly brilliant lawyer, David. I told David to prepare my financial portfolio. I was not going to let a bunch of random strangers buy the ruins of my family restaurant. I had a much better plan. I was going to buy it completely for myself. I wanted to stand right inside that massive dark building and carefully watch my dedicated construction crew forcefully tear down every single remaining wall. I was absolutely ready to finish this amazing story of sweet revenge once and forever. The morning of the public commercial auction arrived with bright blue skies. I did not personally attend the event. I was busy managing the intense lunch service at Aura, completely focused on my thriving business and incredible staff. Instead, I sent my brilliant lawyer David to stand on the crowded front steps of the county courthouse. David was dressed in a sharp, understated suit, blending in perfectly with the massive crowd of wealthy real estate developers and seasoned restaurant investors. Everyone in the city knew the incredible value of the massive glass front building that previously housed the legacy. They all wanted to acquire the prime real estate situated directly across the street from my incredibly successful flagship restaurant. The auctioneer stepped up to the wooden podium and began the rapid-fire bidding process. Because the property carried the heavy stigma of a massive public bankruptcy and the lingering terrible taint of Kendrick's federal wire fraud indictment, the opening bids started shockingly low. David stood quietly at the back of the massive crowd holding a plain numbered bidding paddle. He represented a newly formed limited liability company that we had created specifically for this exact transaction. The corporate name completely concealed my identity from the public record. The bidding war was initially aggressive, with several prominent restaurant groups trying to secure the coveted location. But David had strict instructions from me, and he had the full financial backing of my $10 million venture capital fund. Every time another wealthy investor raised their paddle, David immediately countered with a much higher number, projecting absolute financial dominance. He did not hesitate or flinch or look around the crowd. Eventually, the other bidders realized they were fighting a completely unwinnable battle against an incredibly deep-pocketed anonymous buyer. One by one, they slowly dropped their paddles and stepped back in defeat. The auctioneer called out the final price 3 times before violently slamming his heavy wooden gavel against the podium. The massive building was officially sold for absolute pennies on the dollar. When David called my mobile phone to confirm the massive victory, I simply smiled and thanked him for his excellent work. My family had spent an absolute fortune trying to build a monument to their own massive egos, and I had just purchased their completely ruined dream for a tiny fraction of its original cost. 3 days after the intense public auction, the heavy brass keys to the building were officially delivered to my new office. I waited until the late afternoon when the bright sun was beginning to set over the city to take my very first walk through the acquired property. I crossed the busy street and confidently unlocked the massive front glass doors. The interior of the legacy was completely silent and incredibly cold. The air smelled of stale dust and profound failure. I walked slowly through the massive empty dining room, my footsteps echoing loudly off the polished hardwood floors. I looked up at the expensive crystal chandeliers my mother Patricia had meticulously selected to impress her wealthy friends. I looked at the exact spot where my sister Sloane had foolishly tried to play the role of a brilliant creative director while secretly pouring my money away. I walked over to the back office where my father Richard had arrogantly delivered his ridiculous lectures about family loyalty and where Kendrick had illegally forged the documents that ultimately destroyed their entire lives. The ghosts of their massive arrogance and their incredible cruelty still lingered in the dark shadows of the empty room. But I did not feel any sadness or lingering anger as I stood there. I only felt a deep, profound sense of complete, absolute closure. I pushed through the heavy swinging doors and walked into the massive commercial kitchen. This was the exact spot where my father had aggressively ripped my apron from my neck and told me to stay hidden in the background like a servant. It was the exact spot where they had tried to steal my immense talent to fund their fake, wealthy lifestyle. I stood in the center of the dark kitchen and took a deep, cleansing breath. A few moments later, the heavy steel alley door pushed open. My elite construction foreman walked in, followed by a dedicated team of workers carrying heavy sledgehammers and massive demolition equipment. The foreman walked up to me, holding a rolled-up set of architectural blueprints. He asked me if I was absolutely ready to begin the massive interior teardown process. I looked around the dark kitchen and then out toward the expensive front dining room. I nodded my head and gave the official order to tear down absolutely everything. I instructed the dedicated crew to rip out the expensive crystal chandeliers, destroy the custom Italian leather booths, and completely gut the entire front dining space down to the bare concrete foundation. I was not going to reopen the building as a rival restaurant. I did not need another beautiful dining room because Aura was breaking massive city records every single night. Instead, I was converting my family's absolute greatest vanity project into a massive industrial prep kitchen and a massive dry storage warehouse for my rapidly expanding multi-million-dollar culinary empire. I was going to use their precious failed dream to chop my daily vegetables, store my bulk cooking flour, and house my extra commercial refrigeration units. I watched proudly as the very first sledgehammer swung violently through the expensive decorative drywall, shattering the last remaining piece of the legacy into 1,000 tiny pieces. I turned around and walked confidently back out into the bright, beautiful Chicago evening. The long, terrible war was officially over, and I had finally achieved total, absolute victory. Looking back on this entire incredible journey, the most valuable lesson I learned is that sharing a bloodline with someone does not automatically give them the right to disrespect you or destroy your future. For years, I operated under the incredibly toxic illusion that I had to constantly sacrifice my own happiness and my own massive potential just to keep the peace in my family. I let them convince me that I was nothing more than a background character in their glamorous lives. But the absolute truth is that your environment dictates your growth. When you are planted in toxic soil surrounded by people who only want to exploit your hard work, you will never fully bloom. Walking away from my family was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the ultimate act of self-preservation. Success truly is the absolute best revenge. When you stop pouring your precious energy into people who secretly want to see you fail and start pouring that exact same energy into your own dreams, you become completely unstoppable. Do not ever let anyone dim your bright light just because their own lives are incredibly dark. Have you ever had to walk away from a highly toxic family member or completely cut ties with people who constantly underestimated your incredible worth? I would absolutely love to hear your personal stories of triumph and resilience in the comments section right below this video. If my story resonated with you today, please make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional stories about taking back your personal power. Share this video with anyone in your life who might really need a strong reminder that they are worthy of massive success. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that your greatest victory is always waiting for you right on the other side of your hardest goodbye.